March the 1st, 1953. The most feared man in the Soviet Union is lying motionless on the floor of his dacha, surrounded by his own bodily fluids. For hours, no one dares to enter his room. The guards stand frozen in terror. His closest allies debate whether to call a doctor or let nature take its course. This is the story of how the man who controlled the fate of millions met his end in the most humiliating way possible. How paranoia, fear, and a twisted system of power created the conditions for one of history's most ironic deaths. But to understand how it all unraveled, we need to go back just one day earlier. The night of February 28th, 1953, began like countless others at Stalin's Kuntsevo dacha. The 74-year-old dictator had settled into his usual routine. He spent his evenings watching movies and dining with his inner circle until the early hours of the morning. That night, his dinner guests included 4 men who had survived by following one simple rule: never question Stalin. Lavrenti Beria, the head of the secret police, whose round glasses hid eyes that had witnessed unspeakable horrors. Georgy Malenkov, the quiet administrator who many believed would be Stalin's successor. Nikita Khrushchev, who had risen to power through cunning and ruthlessness. And Nikolai Bulganin, the former furniture maker who now served as deputy premier. Each of these men had signed death warrants for thousands. Each had eliminated rivals without hesitation. Yet in Stalin's presence, they became nervous servants, competing for his approval while quietly planning their own survival. The atmosphere around Stalin's dinner table was always tense, a deadly theater where one wrong word could seal your fate. The dining room tried to look sophisticated. Georgian wines filled crystal glasses. Traditional Russian dishes sat on fine china. Paintings of Soviet history covered the walls. But beneath this surface, violence lurked in every interaction. The meal dragged on past midnight, as it always did. Stalin seemed in good spirits that night. He joked with his guests and told stories about the old days. He looked healthy for his age. His thick mustache was neatly groomed. His eyes were sharp despite the late hour. There was no sign that this would be his final evening as the ruler of the Soviet Union. The conversation touched on various matters of state, but also revealed the paranoia that consumed Stalin's inner circle. Beria and Khrushchev exchanged sharp comments while maintaining forced smiles. Malenkov sat quietly, watching carefully. He understood that survival meant reading the room correctly. Stalin deliberately kept his subordinates suspicious of each other. He knew that if they feared each other, they couldn't unite against him. Around 4 a.m., Stalin finally dismissed his guests. Each man approached him individually, thanking him for his hospitality and pledging their loyalty. Stalin accepted these declarations with casual arrogance. The men filed out of the dacha, each breathing a quiet sigh of relief. They had survived another evening with the most dangerous man in the Soviet Union. They climbed into their official cars and drove back to Moscow, unaware that they had just witnessed the end of an era. However, what happened next would expose the rotting foundation of Stalin's empire. March the 1st passed quietly at first. The sun rose over the snow-covered grounds of the Kuntsevo dacha. Inside the residence, the staff went about their morning routines with practiced efficiency. The guards maintained their posts. The housekeepers prepared for the day. The kitchen staff began planning the evening meal. Everything seemed normal, but as the hours passed, an unusual tension began to settle over the household. Stalin's personal valet, a man named Mikhail Butusov, noticed something strange. No sounds were coming from Stalin's quarters. No footsteps, no running water, no calls for service. The silence was absolute and increasingly disturbing. Butusov had served Stalin for nearly a decade. He had learned to read the dictator's moods with remarkable accuracy. But this complete silence was unprecedented. Even when Stalin was ill, there were always sounds. Movement, water running, calls for help. This silence was different. It was wrong. The valet faced a terrible dilemma. Stalin had given strict orders that he was never to be disturbed during his rest periods. The consequences of breaking this rule could be severe, potentially fatal. Previous servants who had awakened Stalin too early had faced imprisonment or worse. The dictator's paranoia had reached such heights that even his most loyal staff lived in constant fear. Yet the silence was becoming impossible to ignore. By early evening, nearly 18 hours had passed since Stalin had dismissed his dinner guests. The valet paced nervously outside the dictator's suite, torn between his duty to check on his master and his terror of the consequences. The other staff members began to whisper among themselves. They gathered in small groups, speaking in hushed tones. Some suggested that perhaps Stalin was ill. Others wondered if he had simply decided to sleep longer than usual. None dared to voice their growing suspicion that something was seriously wrong. The cook, an elderly woman who had prepared Stalin's meals for over 15 years, expressed concern about the evening's dinner. She had received no instructions about what Stalin wanted to eat, which was highly unusual. Stalin was known for his specific food preferences. He always approved the menu in advance. But today, nothing. Just silence. The head of security was informed of the situation. But he too was paralyzed by the rigid protocols that governed life at the dacha. Stalin's orders regarding privacy were absolute. No one was permitted to enter his private quarters without explicit permission, regardless of the circumstances. The security chief knew that making the wrong decision could result in his own destruction. The security system at the dacha had been designed to protect Stalin from outside threats, but it had also become a prison of rules and procedures that prevented anyone from acting when he actually needed help. The very system meant to ensure Stalin's safety had become an obstacle to saving him. As night fell on March 1st, the atmosphere at the dacha had become almost unbearable. The staff moved about like ghosts, their anxiety growing with each passing hour. They were trapped in a nightmare. Victims of a system so rigid and fear-based that it prevented them from taking even basic steps to help their leader. The irony was impossible to miss. Here was the most powerful man in the Soviet Union, lying helpless somewhere inside, while his terrified servants stood outside his door, too afraid to help. The very system of terror that Stalin had created to maintain his power had become the instrument of his isolation in his moment of greatest need. But the real horror was yet to come. At approximately 6:30 p.m. on March the 1st, Stalin's valet finally summoned the courage to enter the dictator's private quarters. What he found there would haunt him for the rest of his life. The door to Stalin's study opened with a soft creak. Butusov stepped cautiously into the room. The heavy curtains were drawn, casting everything in deep shadows. The familiar scent of Stalin's tobacco mixed with something else. Something wrong. Stalin lay sprawled on the floor of his study, his body twisted in an unnatural position. He had clearly been there for many hours, possibly since early morning. His clothing was soiled, his face was pale and drawn, his breathing was labored and irregular. The great dictator, who had commanded the fear and respect of millions, had been reduced to a helpless figure lying in his own waste. The man who had decided the fate of entire nations with a casual signature was now unable to control his own body. The irony was brutal and complete. Papers were scattered across the floor. A glass lay shattered nearby. The chair behind his desk was overturned. The scene told the story of a sudden, catastrophic medical emergency. Stalin had been working at his desk when it happened. He had fallen, and for over 14 hours he had lain there alone, suffering. Butusov's first instinct was to call for help, but even in this moment of crisis, the paralyzing fear asserted itself. He stood frozen, unsure of what to do. If he called for help and Stalin recovered, would he be punished for violating the dictator's privacy? If he failed to act and Stalin died, would he be blamed? There was no winning option. After several minutes of panic, the valet contacted the head of security. Colonel Ivan Krustalev arrived within minutes. He took one look at the scene and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. However, like the valet, he too found himself paralyzed. The two men stood over their fallen leader, debating in hushed, urgent tones. Should they call a doctor immediately? Should they contact Stalin's political allies first? Should they attempt to move him to a more dignified position? Each option carried enormous risks. The conversation revealed the depths of psychological damage that Stalin's reign had inflicted. These were not cowards or fools. They were men who had been so thoroughly terrorized that they could not trust their own judgment, even in a clear medical emergency. The system had stripped them of their basic humanity. The security chief decided to contact Beria first. He reasoned that the secret police chief would know how to handle such a delicate situation. The call was made. Within an hour, Beria arrived at the dacha with Malenkov. When Beria and Malenkov saw Stalin's condition, their reactions revealed cold calculation. While they expressed appropriate concern for their leader's health, their primary focus was on managing the political implications of the crisis. They understood that Stalin's collapse represented both a danger and an opportunity. Beria's first words upon seeing Stalin were not about his health. Instead, he asked who else knew about the situation. His immediate priority was information control. The secret police chief understood that controlling the narrative would be crucial for maintaining stability and positioning himself for the power struggle that might follow. The discussion that followed was conducted in whispers. Beria argued for limiting the number of people who knew about Stalin's condition. Malenkov agreed. They convinced themselves that Stalin's condition appeared stable, despite his obvious distress. They reasoned that a few more hours would not make a significant difference in his recovery, but could provide valuable time to prepare for the political upheaval ahead. This decision would prove to be one of the most consequential in Soviet history. But, at the time, it seemed like prudent political maneuvering to men who had spent their careers navigating the treacherous waters of Stalinist politics. Word was sent to Khrushchev and Bulganin, summoning them to the dacha. When they arrived and saw Stalin's condition, they too began calculating their positions in the coming power struggle. The four men now stood over their fallen leader, each lost in thoughts about the future. The grotesque irony was undeniable. Here they were debating the fate of the Soviet Union, while their leader lay in his own waste on the floor. The man who had terrorized millions was now completely dependent on subordinates who had every reason to wish him dead. Yet even as they planned for Stalin's potential death, another layer of irony was unfolding. It was not until the early hours of March 2nd, nearly 24 hours after Stalin's collapse, that his lieutenants finally agreed to summon medical assistance. The delay was not due to lack of available doctors. It was due to political calculations and personal fears that had paralyzed everyone. When doctors were finally called, yet another problem emerged. Just months earlier, Stalin had launched what became known as the Doctor's Plot. This was a paranoid campaign targeting Jewish physicians whom he believed were conspiring to eliminate Soviet leaders. Many of the country's most skilled doctors had been arrested, imprisoned, or executed. The surviving doctors lived in constant fear. This created a devastating situation. The doctors who were summoned to treat Stalin were terrified of making any decision that could later be seen as deliberate harm. They understood that if Stalin died under their care, they would likely be blamed and executed themselves. The medical team was led by Professor Lukomsky, one of the few prominent physicians who had survived Stalin's recent purges. When the doctors examined Stalin, they found he had suffered a massive stroke. The damage to his brain was extensive. His condition was critical. However, the doctors were reluctant to make definitive statements about his prognosis, knowing that delivering bad news could be seen as sabotage. The medical team faced an impossible situation. They needed to treat their patient, but they also needed to protect themselves from political consequences. Every decision could potentially be used against them later. They were afraid to administer certain medications or procedures that might be necessary, knowing that if Stalin died, they would be blamed regardless. The irony was profound and tragic. Stalin's paranoid persecution of doctors had created a situation where the medical professionals, who might have saved his life, were too terrified to provide optimal care. The system of terror he had created had turned against him in his moment of greatest vulnerability. Throughout the following days, Stalin's condition continued to deteriorate. His breathing became more labored, his responses less frequent. The man who had controlled the fate of millions was slipping away, surrounded by people who feared him even as he lay dying. As March 2nd gave way to March 3rd and then to March 4th and 5th, it became increasingly clear that Stalin's condition was beyond medical help. The damage from the stroke was too severe. The delay in receiving treatment had eliminated any realistic hope of recovery. The atmosphere at the dacha became increasingly surreal. Stalin's allies continued their whispered conversations about the future. Doctors moved quietly around the dying dictator. The household staff went about their duties with mechanical precision, still too frightened to show emotion. Beria began to assert himself more aggressively. As Stalin's condition worsened, the damage from the stroke was too severe. The delay in receiving treatment had eliminated any realistic hope of recovery. The atmosphere at the dacha became increasingly surreal. Stalin's allies continued their whispered conversations about the future. Doctors moved quietly around the dying dictator. The household staff went about their duties with mechanical precision, still too frightened to show emotion. Beria began to assert himself more aggressively. As Stalin's condition worsened, he started issuing orders to security staff and making decisions about access to the dacha. His actions revealed his expectation that he would play a major role in the post-Stalin government. Khrushchev watched these developments with growing concern. He understood that Beria's control of the secret police made him the most dangerous potential successor. The Ukrainian began thinking carefully about how to counter Beria's influence. The transformation was complete. The powerful leader who had shaped the Soviet Union through sheer force of will and brutality was now reduced to a failing body, dependent on others for his most basic needs. The contrast between his former power and his current helplessness was stark and sobering. At approximately 9:50 p.m. on March 5, 1953, Joseph Stalin drew his final breath. The man who had ruled the Soviet Union with an iron fist for nearly 3 decades was dead. The immediate reaction of those present was a mixture of relief, uncertainty, and carefully controlled emotion. No one dared to celebrate openly, but there was a sense that an era had ended. The fear that had dominated their lives was beginning to lift, replaced by anxiety about an uncertain future. Beria was the first to speak after Stalin's death was confirmed. He immediately began issuing orders about securing the dacha and controlling information about Stalin's passing. His actions revealed that he had been planning for this moment. The official announcement was carefully crafted to mask the chaos behind the scenes. The Soviet people were told that their great leader had passed peacefully after a brief illness, surrounded by his most loyal comrades. In reality, Stalin had lain alone for hours on the floor of his dacha, unattended and ignored out of sheer terror by his subordinates who feared the consequences of acting without direct orders. The state funeral was grand and theatrical, designed to project an image of unity. Massive crowds filled the streets of Moscow, weeping and waving portraits. Many genuinely unaware of the atrocities committed under his rule, they grieved with sincere devotion. Others wept from confusion, fear, or habit. The contradiction was profound. A nation mourning a tyrant, unable to separate personal grief from decades of propaganda. Behind the scenes, however, a ruthless power struggle had already begun. Beria initially seemed poised to seize control. His dominance, however, made him a threat to others. Within months, Beria was arrested in a carefully staged coup by his former allies. He was accused of treason and executed after a secret trial. The man who had orchestrated countless purges was devoured by the same system of suspicion and betrayal he had enforced for decades. Khrushchev eventually emerged as the dominant figure in the new leadership. In 1956, he delivered his famous secret speech to the party Congress, denouncing Stalin's cult of personality and revealing some of the regime's crimes. This marked the beginning of de-Stalinization, a cautious effort to distance the regime from its most extreme abuses while preserving party authority. Yet even as the new leadership sought to move forward, The terror continued in smaller ways. The doctors who had treated Stalin continued to be viewed with suspicion. Some were arrested or interrogated, accused of medical negligence or conspiracy. Their fate was a grim echo of the doctor's plot. The staff at the Kuntsevo dacha found themselves under investigation. Every action, every hesitation during Stalin's final hours was scrutinized for signs of treason. The fear that had prevented them from entering his room without permission now transformed into fear of punishment for not doing so. It was a cruel irony. The terror Stalin had instilled had likely cost him his life. Yet the same terror ensured that those who hesitated would be blamed for his death. Perhaps most tragically, the architecture of Stalin's tyranny did not vanish with his passing. The vast network of surveillance, censorship, and repression he had built continued to function. The psychological legacy, paranoia, mistrust, conformity, and self-censorship endured within Soviet society. Entire generations bore the imprint of a world where independent thought was dangerous, dissent was fatal, and blind obedience was the surest path to survival. It would take decades for the Soviet Union to confront the enormity of the crimes committed during Stalin's rule. And even then, the reckoning remained incomplete. For many, the wounds never fully healed. The death of Stalin closed a chapter of terror, but the book remained open, its pages still haunted by the ghosts of those who lived and died under his reign. The brutal final hours of Joseph Stalin's life serve as a powerful reminder of the ultimate futility of absolute power and the self-destructive nature of systems built on fear and terror. The man who terrorized millions died alone and helpless, killed by the very system he created. His guards stood frozen outside his door. His doctors were too afraid to treat him properly. His closest allies delayed calling for help while they calculated their political positions. The irony is complete. The terror system functioned perfectly, right up until the moment it destroyed its creator. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe to see more history documentaries that reveal the hidden truths behind world-changing events.